Hi Maya, thank you so much for joining us today and for agreeing to answer our questions about translation. Can you please start by telling us about yourself? How did you come to translation field? What attracted you in it? How long have you been doing, and so on and so forth?
Okay, so my name is Maya and I'm a native English speaker. I didn't grow up in a multilingual home, but I've always been a bit of a language person. I also kind of came to language through culture. My family's also always loved Latin American culture, my mother, my grandmother, and so it was sort of a natural progression for me to kind of also fall in love with Latin American culture. So I started studying Spanish at an early age. And I did an undergraduate degree in international development where I focused and I did a minor in Spanish, and then I moved on to do a master's degree in translation studies at Clinton.
What are your fields of specialization in translation? What do you enjoy most?
So I tend to specialize in legal and medical translation. You kind of go where the work is, and so I've spent a lot of time working on developing my skills in those fields. But I also really love translating things that help newcomers or help relay information to people who don't necessarily have access to that information. So it could be helping someone with a refugee claim or things like that. I always enjoy work where I can kind of see the impact it's having.
What do you like most in the translation process?
I always love when I get a new translation project and I'm kind of looking at it for the first time. I'm looking at the new words or words that might give me some problem, and I'm doing some problems, and I'm doing a bit of research. That part I always get excited at that stage.
So we realize there are sometimes the translation can be challenging when you, as you said, there are known words or maybe concepts that you never heard of, or as not an expert in a subject matter can also cause any difficulties. How do you deal with this, with coping with difficulties in translation?
So I think research is obviously number one. I try and look at how others have dealt with difficult passages in their translations. But then I also like to come up with a few different possible solutions, because then I can sort of have a look and decide amongst the possible solutions which one's the best. Not always the first thing you come up with is going to be the best. So it's always good to sort of force yourself to come up with a few different solutions. I also find it's really helpful if you revisit some issues later on. So you might have a translation, the difficulties at the beginning, so you finish the translation, and when you go back and review it, sort of think about it as a whole, and that can be really useful.
What, in your opinion, is the most important skill a modern translator should have?
I think, in my opinion, flexibility is very, very important for the modern day translator. The technologies and tools are always changing, so staying up to speed on those, and also seeing where the market's going, things like that. Sort of always having your pulse on translation.
How do you keep up to date on new topics, tools, and sharpening your skills in both languages?
I think reading's obviously very important. I try and read newspapers in both languages a little bit at least every day. And I also am constantly checking forums and threads and chat groups for translators to see what they're discussing and sort of relate also, right? Because lots of times we're very solitary creatures working on our projects, and it's good to see what other people are up to.
In your opinion, how can a novice translator get more hands-on experience in translation?
I started volunteering very early on, and I think there's lots of great organizations out there that are looking for volunteers to help them translate different kinds of material into different languages. Obviously, you can't go into it completely blind. I would recommend, and most people would recommend, and often the organizations require that you have a little bit of a background, at least have studied a little bit about translation. So done some training.
Can you name a few organizations that are there?
Yeah, well, I know we'll probably talk about this again, but the Rosetta Foundation is a great organization that are always looking for volunteers into different languages. There's also Translators Without Borders.
So I know you were involved in Rosetta Foundation project. Was it a translation related?
My role with the Rosetta Foundation was not actually related to translation. I also have a bit of a background in fundraising, so I was their corporate partnerships manager for a while. But I always like to ask about the different translation projects and sort of know what kinds of languages they were looking for. And whenever they had languages that were difficult, I would try and help them find translators.
How did you get involved into this project?
I always knew about the Rosetta Foundation, and as someone who studied international development, I've always been looking for ways to sort of blend my two areas of expertise, translation and development. So I was always kind of had one eye open for looking for opportunities with NGOs that also dealt with translation. And when I saw the opening, I thought, I have to at least try and be involved. And it was difficult at times because they're based out of Ireland. So all of our meetings were via Skype and GoToMeeting and things like that.
What is your philosophy of translation?
Well, I think the most important philosophy I have is that translation matters, access to information matters, and although we don't always get the credit for facilitating communication and access to communication, it's extremely important.
Can you develop and say why translation matters?
Why translation matters?
You mentioned that it provides an access to communication for people who cannot.
Yeah. Well, if I'm gonna go more like meta about it, like people matter. We all matter, and we all have an opinion and a right to an opinion, and we all have a right to health and a good life. So I think that if I'm gonna talk about it as a whole, it's making sure that people get to live the best life they can, and I mean in my experiences, I work a lot with working on refugee claims and things like that, so I can see firsthand how important translation is in helping facilitate these people coming to Canada and having a better life.
So nowadays practitioners and scholars of translation talk more and more about social impact of translation. So can you explain us what is meant by this term and why there is this turn to society and culture in translation? Like what was it?
So you want to know what the definition of social impact?
I mean, in your words.
In my words. Yeah. I guess social impact is always like making a difference in the lives of others, whether that be in their livelihood or health or in their home. So just using translation, sort of what I've been talking about, to help further these different aspects of a person's life.
Why do you think there is more and more turn to that nowadays specifically?
Well, I think it's sort of something that people are becoming more self-reflective in many spheres of society. It's not just translation, and so it's a natural sort of progression that would also move into translation. Not only self-reflective, but seeing how any individual can make a difference in their life and the lives of others.
How do you see the role of a translator nowadays? How can they become visible and make this impact more tangible?
Well, I think the roles of translators are very diverse. Some act as mediators of culture, some, relay essential information. It depends on what you're translating and who you're translating for and things like that. But I think your second part was how they could become more visible. I think talking about translation and gathering as a community of translators, and that's how you start to make your voice heard and start to gain visibility, and also talking about the impact we have as translators in the lives of others.
Okay, thank you so much.
No problem.